Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to another mega Dickens read-along video. Today I'm going to be giving you my thoughts and reflections on Charles Dickens's book A Tale of Two Cities. So if you don't know what the Mega Dickens read-along is, I will leave some more links down below. This is a 2-year-long read-along where we have been reading the works of Charles Dickens in chronological order. We are nearing the end, and the book for May 2024 was A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. So I have lots of thoughts about this to talk to you about in this video today. There will be some spoilers in the second half of the video, but not at the beginning, and I will warn you before the spoilers come in. So, before I get into my thoughts about A Tale of Two Cities, let me tell you a bit about what it is about. So A Tale of Two Cities is one of Charles Dickens's few historical novels, and it is set not in the Victorian period when it was written, but in the late 18th century, in both France and Britain. The two cities of the title are London and Paris, and the book follows the Manette family from the 1770s through to the 1780s, the French Revolution and the aftermath of the French Revolution. In the beginning of the novel, a French doctor called Dr. Manette, who has been unjustly imprisoned for the best part of 2 decades, is released from his prison and reunited with his daughter Lucy, who is then I think about 17 or 18 years old, and we then follow this family, Lucy and her father, over a number of years, following their family life and also what happens when they get caught up in the French Revolution. So I feel like this was my 3rd or 4th reading of A Tale of Two Cities, and I've come away with it with slightly mixed feelings. I feel like A Tale of Two Cities has probably actually gone down in my estimation on this reread in comparison to most of the other books I have been reading for the Mega Dickens read-along, most of which have gone up. I do love it a lot, like it's a Dickens novel, of course I love it, and I do think there are some fantastic elements, especially sort of the dramatic crowd scenes and the very ending of the novel. I feel like it's a very beautiful book in many ways. But I do feel that, for me, the characterization for the majority of the characters is very thin, and for me, it really falls flat in comparison to the rest of Dickens. It's a very different Dickens book, I would say, which I think is one of the reasons why a lot of people who don't love Dickens as a whole really like A Tale of Two Cities. But for me, it really lacks some of the elements I love most in Dickens's books. So I have kind of mixed, complicated feelings about it, as we'll see in this video. I feel like I'm going to be harsher in this video than I usually am in the Mega Dickens Read-Along Reflections video, or at least harsher than I've been since Oliver Twist. I just don't love A Tale of Two Cities like I love a lot of other Dickens books, or I love bits of it, but I don't love it as a whole. I will also say, in defense of A Tale of Two Cities, that I don't think I had the best reading experience this time. So I listened to the audiobook narrated by Simon Callow, which is a really, really great audiobook. I definitely would recommend it. But I have been rereading all of Dickens on audiobook throughout the Mega Dickens read-along, and one thing I've been doing a lot is listening to Dickens in the car while driving, because these are all books that I've read lots of times before. I know them really, really well. When I'm driving, I like to listen to an audiobook, but I never like to listen to a new audiobook. I only like to listen to a reread because I know that my primary focus is on driving rather than on listening to the audiobook, obviously. And A Tale of Two Cities I listened to an audiobook, and I listened to a lot of it while driving because it is a shorter book and a shorter audiobook than a lot of the other Dickens books that we've been reading. I feel like I read a lot more of this while driving than I have of the other Dickens books we've been reading. I feel like I probably listened to 75-80% of A Tale of Two Cities while driving. And in fact, I had one day where I was doing a really long drive for a weekend away, and the traffic was absolutely terrible. So what should have been a 3-hour drive was a 7-hour drive, and I listened to basically half of A Tale of Two Cities just on that one very trafficy, rainy, miserable drive. So I feel like that didn't necessarily make for the best reading experience of A Tale of Two Cities. And also I feel like actually I didn't remember A Tale of Two Cities as well as I did a lot of the other Dickens books. Actually, I feel like A Tale of Two Cities was one of the ones where I'd had a really big gap since I last read it. I last read it 10 or 11 years ago, and I think probably every other Dickens book I had read more recently. And in my head, I still knew A Tale of Two Cities really well. I studied it at university in history, not in English literature, which is really fun. But I think I had in my head that I knew it really well, whereas actually maybe I didn't know it as well. So maybe it wasn't the best one to reread while driving, where as I said, obviously my focus was on driving more than on Dickens. So I feel like I am being slightly unfair to A Tale of Two Cities, but I still have always thought and stand by my thought that the characterization is not the best for most of the characters, with a few exceptions. So yeah. I don't know. I have complicated feelings about A Tale of Two Cities. That was a long ramble about my reading experience this time. Anyway, when I do these reflections videos, I always like to place a Dickens book in its chronology and look at the books either side of it and kind of the overarching trends of Dickens's career, I guess. I find A Tale of Two Cities a hard one to think about chronologically because it is so different. I think especially it's a weird one to come straight after Little Dorrit because Little Dorrit is so very much character driven and not very plot driven at all, and Tale of Two Cities is like the opposite. It is very, very plot driven and the characters are less important than the plot. And then next we have Great Expectations, which I feel like is somewhere in between, so maybe that kind of makes sense, I don't know, but I almost feel like Dickens was writing A Tale of Two Cities in reaction to Little Dorrit. I would be interested to know actually how Little Dorrit did, because I do feel like from what I know about Dickens's writing career, he was quite a reactive writer, and I suppose I'm just thinking like quite a few people doing the Mega Dickens read-along struggled with Little Dorrit a bit because it was so character-driven and less plot-driven, and I wonder if maybe readers at the time also felt that, and therefore Dickens was like, next I shall do something very plot-driven. I don't know, that's just my imagination. Rereading A Tale of Two Cities also made me think back to Barnaby Rudge, which was Dickens's 5th published novel, so I think there's something like 17 or 18 years between Dickens writing Barnaby Rudge and Dickens writing A Tale of Two Cities, but they do have quite a lot in common. They're his two works of historical fiction set in the 18th century. Both of them look quite a lot at violence and mob violence and revenge, and I feel like they both do kind of interesting similar things with the crowd scenes. Previous to the Mega Dickens read-along, I would have said that I liked A Tale of Two Cities a lot more than Barnaby Rudge, and Barnaby Rudge was quite low in my estimation, but I feel like having reread both in the last year or two, I feel like Barnaby Rudge ranks a lot higher for me, and I like it a lot more because I feel like the characterization is a lot more interesting than in A Tale of Two Cities. Anyway, sorry, I feel like this is going to be a very negative video. I do love Dickens, I promise. There are lots of themes that come up in A Tale of Two Cities which we see in other Dickens novels, which I find interesting. One kind of interesting theme to think about that connects Little Dorrit and A Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations, which we'll be reading next, is the theme of imprisonment, which is very important in Little Dorrit. Amy's father has been in the Marshalsea prison for debt for I think 22 years. He's never stirred outside of that place. And then in A Tale of Two Cities we meet Lucy Manette and her father, Dr. Manette. And Dr. Manette has been imprisoned in the Bastille for nearly 2 decades, and he is just coming out of prison at the very beginning of Tale of Two Cities and is really struggling with the kind of trauma of having been imprisoned. The theme of imprisonment also comes up kind of in Great Expectations. The very opening of Great Expectations features a convict who has escaped. So in all of these 3 books we have this kind of theme of like imprisonment and escaping from imprisonment, which I find really, really interesting. Like that was obviously just very much on Dickens's mind. And then obviously from the last few things I was saying, you'll also get a sense that in Little Dorrit we have this father-daughter relationship at the heart of the novel, Amy and her father, Mr. Dorrit. And then in A Tale of Two Cities there is a key father-daughter relationship too, Lucy Manette's relationship with her father, Dr. Manette, which I feel is important in the novel, but is not like as interesting as Amy's relationship with her father, but also their relationship doesn't like drive the plot in the same way that I think it kind of does in Little Dorrit. But maybe that's just me being harsh on A Tale of Two Cities. Anyway, another character I find very interesting to place in chronology is Sidney Carton, because I find Sidney Carton a really interesting character. I do think he's the best character in A Tale of Two Cities, and I think he is far superior to a lot of other characters in A Tale of Two Cities in terms of the depth of his characterization. But I think Sidney Carton is a really interesting character because I feel like I can draw a line from James Harthouse in Hard Times to Sidney Carton in A Tale of Two Cities to Eugene Wrayburn in Our Mutual Friend. And I feel like that's a very interesting line to look at, like how these 3 characters are similar and how they're different. That's something I really enjoy. I feel like James Harthouse was kind of a rehearsal for Sidney Carton, and I kind of feel like Sidney Carton was a rehearsal for Eugene Wrayburn. I do think Sidney Carton is a wonderful character, but you don't get quite as much time with him as you get with Eugene Wrayburn in Our Mutual Friend. I think one of the reasons why I struggle with A Tale of Two Cities is, for me, it feels like a step back in terms of characterization rather than a step forwards. Like, I feel like throughout the course of Dickens's career, you can see his characterization grow in depth and strength. You know, in his earlier books, a lot of his characters are quite kind of one-dimensional, and sometimes he has fun eccentrics, and sometimes his characters are interesting, but a lot of the time his characters feel a bit flatter. And then the further you go into his writing career and the later you get in his novels, the more rich and fascinating and complex his characters become, and he has this wonderful mix sometimes of the really kind of like complicated, psychologically real characters with these eccentric people who you kind of believe because they're almost like a real person who's just been pushed to an extreme to emphasize this element of them. And I love that in Dickens, and I really have enjoyed seeing how Dickens's characterization grows over time. And then I feel like in A Tale of Two Cities it kind of takes a step back. There are some really interesting characters like Sidney Carton, like Madame Defarge, like Jarvis Lorry actually, who I found really interesting this time and had basically forgotten since the last time I read it. But characters like Lucy Manette and Charles Darnay fall really, really flat for me. And I feel like I struggle especially with Lucy Manette because I feel like she very much falls into the type of early Dickens heroines where she is beautiful and good, and those are her only characteristics. She very much feels like an angel in the house figure to me, and I feel like that makes me struggle with A Tale of Two Cities as a whole because I find her not a very interesting character, and Darnay too is a bit nothingy for me. But also I feel like I would be more emotionally invested in the novel as a whole if Lucy was a more interesting character. Obviously gender is a real like interest for me in Dickens. I wrote my dissertation at university on how Dickens's presentation of gender changes over time throughout his books, and one thing that changes in general throughout the time in his books is that his female characters especially, but all of his characters, become much more complex and realistic and fully formed people. His women stop being angels in the house and become something much more interesting, whereas I feel like Lucy Manette sits much more easily with his kind of early boring heroines, which makes me kind of feel like Charles Dickens was just feeling a bit lazy when he wrote her. Very harsh on Dickens, I'm sorry. Obviously reading is very subjective. I personally find Amy Dorrit a fascinating character, but I know when we were reading Little Dorrit there were a few people who felt that Amy Dorrit kind of maybe fell into a less interesting, more angel in the house figure, which I didn't get at all. So, you know, maybe there are some people who found Lucy Manette a much more interesting character, but I just feel like Dickens kind of fell back into old bad habits of writing really boring women when writing Lucy Manette. Some of the older female characters in A Tale of Two Cities are quite interesting. Madame Defarge is really, really great, and I do really, really like her, and Miss Pross is fairly interesting too, but I feel like Lucy Manette just really bugs me, and Charles Darnay too I have like so little interest in. Another few things that occurred to me in terms of Tale of Two Cities kind of in comparison to the rest of Dickens's books, I think it is in a way a more like poetic novel than some of his other books. I don't really know how to explain that, but I kind of think it is. Again, I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people who don't necessarily love Dickens as a whole really love A Tale of Two Cities. It also reminds me a lot of Hard Times in some ways, both because they are sort of shorter novels, and also they're both novels that are quite sweeping in terms of the time they span. Like Hard Times must span, I guess, 5 to 10 years, and A Tale of Two Cities must span like 25 years, I guess. So it's very like sweeping in terms of time, but also it's very short and very, very focused. And I feel like that's one of the things I like less about A Tale of Two Cities, because I feel like one of the things I love about Dickens is his like 1,000-page complicated messy novels that follow like so many different characters and weave lots of different plots together. If I think about my absolute favourite Dickens novels, that's something they all have in common. But I feel like that's also something in A Tale of Two Cities that probably would appeal to a lot of people, but just doesn't appeal to me as much, because when I'm reading a Dickens book, usually what I want is like a 45-hour audiobook. And I do feel like in A Tale of Two Cities, one of the problems I have with it is that the characters fall flat for me because we don't have enough time with them, or as much time with them as we would usually have in a Dickens book. Anyway, another thing that I wanted to mention in this section is that I do feel like A Tale of Two Cities feels more inspired by French literature than other Dickens books. I feel like you can see a bit of inspiration from Victor Hugo and Alexander Dumas in A Tale of Two Cities, especially The Count of Monte Cristo. Definitely, I feel like if you have read A Tale of Two Cities and you haven't read The Count of Monte Cristo, then you really should read The Count of Monte Cristo. One, because it's just fantastic and brilliant, and better than A Tale of Two Cities in my opinion, but also I feel like those themes of kind of like revenge and false imprisonment and kind of the turbulence of French history just spoke to me in both of them, and I think especially the kind of like unjust imprisonment theme. I do wonder if Charles Dickens had read The Count of Monte Cristo and was inspired by that. Anyway, that's been a long ramble, so let me move on to talking about plot. Overall, I think the plot of A Tale of Two Cities is really, really good. And I do feel like, as I said, I've been a bit negative in this video, but I do think the plot of Tale of Two Cities is really good. I feel like everything about the French Revolution and the violence and the kind of like sweeping movement between France and England, all of that stuff is really good. And I feel like the drama and excitement of A Tale of Two Cities is really well done. I also kind of enjoy the like political intrigue, subplot kind of stuff we get around the general revolution things. I feel like those are done really well. I also think Dr. Antoinette's unjust imprisonment is written really well, and his kind of backstory and the trauma he carries from his time in prison and the role it plays in the novel, I think is done fantastically and is one of the best elements in this book. I do also think that the ending is incredible, and I think it is possibly Charles Dickens' best ending. I say this being not one of my favourite Dickens novels, but the ending is amazing, and I do feel like A Tale of Two Cities is a wonderful book and is really worth reading, and especially for the ending. Like, I think the ending is just so well done. I think the one element of the plot that doesn't work so well for me is a sort of love story element to the book. Now, it is not very central to the novel in some ways, but I also think there are other ways in which it is important. And I feel like the love story elements are very, very underdeveloped for me, and that is one of the problems I have with the book. I do wonder if I would like this novel more if it were twice the length, with a lot more development of the characters and a less focused plot and more subplots and a kind of slower feel to it. I feel like a lot of other people would enjoy it less, but I do wonder if I would like it more. Let's talk about the characterization, which, as I said, is one of the things that I don't think works so well in A Tale of Two Cities. I feel like there are a couple of characters who are fantastic in A Tale of Two Cities, who I think are really rich and really well done. But even those characters I do want to see more of, and I feel like overall, the characterization in A Tale of Two Cities reminds me of the characterization in Oliver Twist, where there are one or two characters who I think are fascinating and fantastic and really interestingly done, and then all the rest of the characters I'm just not that fussed about and I'm just not invested enough. So there are two characters who I really think are fantastically drawn in A Tale of Two Cities and are really interesting, and are the two things that make this book for me, I guess, and those two characters are Madame Defarge and Sydney Carton. Madame Defarge is a French woman who is very much for the revolution. She feels that her people have been oppressed for a really, really long time and she has had enough. And her strength of character and her remorselessness and her firm convictions and her drive and her knitting are just all so well done. She is such a fantastically created character, and I really, really like Madame Defarge. I kind of wish we saw even more of her, but I do feel like she is one of the most interesting characters in A Tale of Two Cities and one of the most interesting kind of like antagonist figures that Dickens has ever created. Sydney Carton is the other character who I really, really like in this book. He is this dissipated man who feels that he has wasted his life. He is probably an alcoholic. He definitely drinks too much. He doesn't do much work. He feels that his life is completely useless, but he has one thing that redeems him. And we see this kind of throughout A Tale of Two Cities. We see the character journey he goes on, and I just feel like Sydney Carton is so well drawn in A Tale of Two Cities and so well done. Do I wish we saw even more of him? Yes, but I think that he is still like done justice to and is still really, really interesting and works really, really well. I really love Sydney Carton as a character, and I do feel like he's fantastic. And I feel like whenever I'm feeling a bit down on the rest of the characterization in A Tale of Two Cities, I should remind myself how amazing a character I think Sydney Carton is. Another character I really enjoyed reading about this time is Jarvis Lorry. To be honest, I had completely forgotten about the existence of Jarvis Lorry since the last time I read A Tale of Two Cities, but I really like Jarvis Lorry. He is this businessman who very much feels that he must be a businessman and be proper and polite and not be emotional, but he's actually like really, really emotional and sensitive. And he's also quite elderly, and by points later on in the book he's kind of in his 70s, 80s, I think, kind of in the midst of all this panic, kind of staying calm and trying to do his best, and I feel like he is well drawn and I just really, really enjoyed him as a character. Then there are a few characters who I find quite interesting but I don't feel we see enough of. One is Stryver. Again, I had really forgotten him since the last time I read it, but this is Sydney Carton's friend who is very different to him. He's sort of very boisterous and confident, and I quite enjoyed him as a character. I feel like especially in the audiobook narrated by Simon Callow acted him really, really well. But he's a character who I feel like is set out to be quite interesting and then just kind of like fades from view. And I feel like in a longer, full-length Dickens book that was, 1,000 pages, as I like my Dickens books to be, we would have seen a lot more of him and he would have been more interesting. So I don't know. One thing I do find quite interesting is the dynamic between him and Sydney Carton, especially because it makes me think of the dynamic between Mortimer Lightwood and Eugene Wrayburn in Our Mutual Friend, who are another two pair of lawyer friends. Mortimer Lightwood is very different to Stryver. I don't really think he is like Stryver at all. He doesn't have the same personality, but I do wonder if Dickens kind of like enjoyed writing that like two lawyer friends dynamic and decided to kind of do that again in Our Mutual Friend. I also find Dr. Manette quite interesting, and I feel like especially the way he experiences his trauma from years of unjust imprisonment and kind of the struggles he has with his mental health. Like, I feel like all of that stuff is really well done and very well explored. I kind of wish we got to see more of Dr. Manette. I feel like he's a really interesting character, and I do feel like he's well done. There's also Miss Pross, who I think is quite interesting. I don't feel like we see enough of her. Like, I feel like there are a few key moments where she is really, really interesting, but I feel like they're not quite set up enough or worked up to enough. I kind of just want to see even more of her. And I kind of feel the same about Monsieur Defarge, who I think is an interesting character and interesting to kind of compare with his wife, you know, where they're similar and where they're different, but I do kind of wish we got to see more of him over the course of the book. And then there are a few characters who I don't think are done very well. As I've already said, Lucy Manette and Charles Darnay for me really fall very flat. They feel very, very thinly characterised. They feel very kind of one-dimensional. I feel like they are good people, and that is the only characterisation that Dickens has given them, and that makes me quite sad. And you know, not everyone will agree, but for me they really fall flat. Another character that falls really flat for me is Jerry Cruncher, and I feel like this is a shame because he almost like should be one of Dickens's great eccentrics, but he just kind of doesn't really work for me. Like, I don't feel like we see enough of him. I don't feel like he is interesting or eccentric enough. Like, I feel like if I were to like make a few notes about him, he should be like one of Dickens's really wonderful, fun, eccentric characters, but he isn't. And the fact that he isn't means we really lack those like fun, eccentric characters in A Tale of Two Cities. There isn't really anyone who falls into the like Jenny Wren, Mr. Jarndyce, Mr. Panks, like eccentric, wonderful characters who I love in Dickens. Like, there isn't really anyone in that category in A Tale of Two Cities, except for Jerry Cruncher, but I don't really think he's good enough to kind of deserve being in that category. And I feel like that is one of the things I really lack in A Tale of Two Cities. And I kind of get that maybe it'd be out of place in A Tale of Two Cities, which is a much more serious novel in some ways than many of his other books, but also I miss them. And actually one of the reasons why Jerry Cruncher doesn't quite work is because Dickens can't quite work out whether he's comic relief or something darker. I'm sorry I'm being so down on Tale of Two Cities. I do think it's a great novel. It's just not the style of Dickens that I like. The style of Dickens I like is Our Mutual Friend, Bleak House, A Little Dorrit, Dombey and Son, those massive like 1,000-page tomes of lots of different interweaving plots. And A Tale of Two Cities is just a different style of book, and it's less my style of book, and that's fine. I think it's fun that Dickens wrote different kinds of books, but A Tale of Two Cities is not the kind that I love. Anyway, let's talk about the themes, because I do think the themes are really, really interesting in A Tale of Two Cities and really well done in many ways, and I feel like the themes and the plot are much more of a focus in A Tale of Two Cities than the characterization. Like, I get that Dickens was trying to do something different, I just don't like it as much as the other things he did. Anyway, moving on to the themes. One very big theme in A Tale of Two Cities is, of course, like oppression and revenge and sort of cycles of violence. This is such an interesting theme, and it's really explored throughout the novel. It reminds me a lot of Barnaby Rudge, another novel that explores those themes, and I also find it really interesting how that theme is kind of explored both in England and in France. Yes, you have the French Revolution, but also earlier on in the novel we have kind of crowd scenes in England, especially around a hanging at Tyburn. We see how kind of crowds operate in different ways in England and France, and also how revolution feels like a possibility in both Paris and London in some ways. Like, there is this feeling of violence and the possibility of violence in both places. I also feel like the way Dickens presents how the upper classes treat the lower classes in France before the revolution is fantastically written, superbly done, really harrowing and grueling and horrible, but also like very clear and very fantastic. Within A Tale of Two Cities, the French upper classes do not view the lower classes as human whatsoever. There's a scene, it's pretty early on in the novel, so I don't really feel like it's a spoiler, but there's a scene early on where Monseigneur, a French aristocrat, runs over a child in his carriage and the child dies, and he doesn't even care. And the brutality of that and the inhumanity of that is so appalling and atrocious and shocking, as it is meant to be. And I feel like through that and through the events of the rest of the book, Dickens is really well able to explore how violence breeds violence. I also feel like Dickens does a very good job both of looking at crowds as crowds and social groups as social groups, but also at looking at individuals and using individuals to typify a broader section of society. For example, Monseigneur as a character stands in for the whole of the French aristocracy. His behaviour, his brutality, his violence towards people who are less wealthy than him is there to stand in for the whole of the behaviour of the French aristocrats towards the lower classes. And simultaneously we have this kind of similar device with Monsieur Defarge and his colleagues, where men involved in kind of the plotting of the French Revolution, I guess, all call each other Jacques. Like, that is their code name for all of them, is just Jacques. And we have this great scene early on where Dickens is sort of saying, you know, Jacques 1, Jacques 2, Jacques 3, Jacques 4. And the fact that they all call each other Jacques, because they are all kind of a symbol of the ordinary Frenchman who they've decided is called Jacques. Like, I feel like that works really well as a device, and I really, really like that. I feel like it helps explore the theme really well. I also feel like trauma is quite an important theme in A Tale of Two Cities, and how past trauma affects present and future action. And I feel like this is explored both through Dr. Manette as a character, the fact that he has been imprisoned for so long unjustly, how this affects his behaviour, how he has episodes of dissociation, how he's triggered by certain things. Like, I feel like that's explored really well. And I feel like his individual personal trauma is kind of mirrored by the trauma of the French lower classes as a whole. You know, Dickens's interpretation of the French Revolution in A Tale of Two Cities is that the French lower classes have been oppressed and traumatized for so long that the French Revolution is kind of almost like the natural outcome of that trauma. It is the expression of that oppression, and I feel like that's really interestingly done. And that kind of relates to the theme of imprisonment and captivity, which I mentioned earlier, which we see in a few different Dickens books. But we have the kind of literal imprisonment of Dr. Manette mirroring the figurative imprisonment of the people of France who have been imprisoned by this social order for so long. And this leads on in itself to the theme of doubling and mirroring, which is quite important in A Tale of Two Cities in an interesting way. We have Dr. Manette's literal imprisonment mirroring the figurative imprisonment of the French people. We have all the different Jacques involved in the French Revolution, and Charles Darnay and Sidney Carton also look very alike. Our introduction to Sidney Carton is when he is giving evidence in a trial and points out that he looks very similar to Charles Darnay. We also have interesting mirroring between Carton and Stryver, these two lawyers who have very different approaches to life and very different opinions about themselves. And we also have interesting mirroring between Miss Pross and Madame Defarge, these two older women, one British, one French, both of whom are very, very different, and we have some kind of interesting mirroring between them too. Another theme I kind of wanted to raise in relation to A Tale of Two Cities is that of, like, middle class goodness. I feel like at some point I need to make a video or like a video essay or have a long hard think about the idealization of middle classness in Victorian literature, because this is something you see throughout the Victorian period, and it's a really kind of interesting thing in Victorian history, because speaking in very like broad generalizing terms, for a long time the aristocracy was kind of respected and the lower classes were not. And then in the Victorian period, you get this increasing backlash against the upper classes and the aristocracy, the increasing feeling that the upper classes are lazy and exploitative and don't necessarily have good morals, but there is still like a social distaste around poverty. So you get this kind of like idealization of the middle classes as like the best of both worlds, and this idea of like respectability, which is very tied up with middle classness, is really, really important in the Victorian period. And I feel like it's really interesting that you can see in Dickens's books that although he often writes about a big cross-section of society, he very much buys into this idea of like middle class superiority. And I feel like Lucy Manette and Charles Darnay are both used as examples of this. The kind of angel in the house figure is very much a middle class ideal. You know, the angel of the house figure is very much reliant on a household in which there is a married couple and the man earns enough that the woman doesn't need to go out to work, but as a family they're not wealthy or upper class enough that the woman is kind of handing over control of the household to like a housekeeper. Like the angel in the house figure is very much reliant on like a middle class family with like two servants, but the wife of the family is doing quite a lot of the household work, but like the most respectable bits. Like the angel in the house figure is very, very middle class within the Victorian period. I have a bit more to say about this, but I think I'm getting into spoilery territory, so please, if you haven't already read A Tale of Two Cities, do stop this video now and don't keep watching. There are spoilers ahead, you have been warned. Otherwise, if you have already read it, please stick around. Continuing with the point of kind of middle class stuff, I do feel like Charles Darnay's rejection of his aristocratic birth and his attempt to make his living as a tutor is very much him kind of rejecting upper class values and embracing middle class values, and him and Lucy are very much like living a middle class life together, and that is quite important for Dickens. At the very end of the novel, when Sydney Carton is kind of like imagining futures for people, there is this really interesting line: "I see the lives for which I lay down my life, peaceful, useful, prosperous and happy, in their England which I shall see no more." And that word useful I find really, really interesting, especially because it has a lot in common with a line at the very end of Little Dorrit, which speaks of usefulness and happiness. And for the Victorians, this is very much tied up with middle classness. You know, the idea that the aristocrats are wasteful, they're not useful, they're not helping anyone, they're just living off the land, and the very poor are not really contributing either. It's the middle classes who are the most useful. I find this Victorian idea and the kind of Victorian idealisation of the middle classes both kind of horrible and also deeply fascinating. If you're really interested in this idea, I recommend reading some extracts from Self-Help by Samuel Smiles, which is not a very nice book at all, and there's lots of bits where he talks about like people who aren't contributing to society, and when he talks about people who are not contributing to society, he means both like the very upper class aristocrats and also the very lower class people, and the people who he thinks are like contributing to Victorian society are all the people in the middle. And I feel like the idealisation of the British middle classes is a very interesting element of A Tale of Two Cities, considering in France we have this battle between the aristocratic upper classes who are shown to be awful and despicable, and the lower classes who are fighting against them, but also with violence, and are more sympathetic than the upper classes because we understand their reasonings, but are still shown to be violent and extreme. I have some other themes to talk about. One theme I wanted to briefly touch on is unrequited love, because I do feel like this is an important theme in A Tale of Two Cities, and it was one that was important in Little Dorrit too. One interesting thing to think about in terms of unrequited love in A Tale of Two Cities, especially in light of what I was saying about all the doubling going on in A Tale of Two Cities, is that we have three men who are in love with Lucy: Charles Darnay, who she loves back, and also Stryver and Carton. Stryver declares his intention to Jarvis Lorry to propose to Lucy, and Jarvis Lorry says, "Oh no, I really don't think you should do that," in a scene that I really, really enjoy. One of my favourite scenes in A Tale of Two Cities. This is why I feel like we should see more of Stryver as a character, because I just find his like arrogance so entertaining. He actually is another character who should be like one of Dickens's great eccentrics, but we don't see enough of him. But I find Stryver quite an interesting character, and I feel like his unrequited love for Lucy is so selfish. Is it even really love, or does he just think she's pretty and I want to get married, so why not marry her? I think he kind of does. It's not really love, but he feels that he wants to marry Lucy, and then Jarvis Lorry says, "Oh, I don't think she'll have you," and he's like appalled, but then decides, actually no, we'd better if I don't marry her, I'll marry someone richer instead. And this is a very like selfish attitude towards his feelings for Lucy, which you can compare to Sydney Carton's love for Lucy, which is very selfless, and the only selfless thing really about Sydney Carton. And we have this great scene, another great scene in A Tale of Two Cities, where he tells Lucy how he feels, knowing that she has no interest in him, knowing that how she feels about Darnay, and just wanting a little piece of her life, like whatever small piece of her life, whatever small role in her life he can have, that is what he wants. He wants friendship from her because he knows there is no chance of anything more. And I feel like his unrequited love for Lucy is this sort of like saving grace of his otherwise dissipated life, and his great sacrifice for her at the end, where he swaps places with Charles Darnay, lets himself die so that Darnay can live and so that Lucy can have her husband and the father of her child with her. Like, I feel like that is really at the heart of the novel and is so powerful. And I feel like one of the reasons why I don't love A Tale of Two Cities as much as I want to is because I don't feel like I know Lucy enough or find Lucy interesting enough to believe in Carton's great love for her. But I do love Carton as a character, and I do feel like he's so well done, and I do feel like his sacrifice at the end is so interesting, and I do feel like the kind of unrequited love he has for her in this book is really interesting. Now that we're into spoilers, I want to return to the themes of oppression and revenge and cycles of violence and the kind of French Revolution as a whole. I find it very interesting in A Tale of Two Cities that in the kind of the first section of the book, we see a lot of the violence inflicted by the upper classes on the lower classes in huge extremes, with the character of Monseigneur, you know, killing a child and not caring, with the way he dismisses his people who are starving. And then we see that so strongly and vividly portrayed in the first half of the novel. And then in the second half of the novel, we move from the upper classes inflicting violence on the people to the people inflicting violence on the aristocrats, the upper classes, and also just everyone. You know, it is very important in A Tale of Two Cities that it's not just the upper classes, the aristocrats who are being killed and executed. Think about the seamstress in the very last chapter, this working class young woman who has been accused for no reason and is sent to her death along with aristocrats and anybody and everybody else. The violence and dehumanization of those executed in the second half of the novel is meant to mirror the violence in the first half of the novel that the upper classes were inflicting on the lower classes, and Dickens's argument in A Tale of Two Cities is very much that violence breeds violence. There's a bit later on in the novel where Madame Defarge is asked to have mercy and to stop and not to pursue the whole of Charles Darnay's family, and she reminds those present what happened to her own family, how they were brutally treated and killed by Charles Darnay's father and uncle. She says, "That sister of the mortally wounded boy upon the ground was my sister. That husband was my sister's husband. That unborn child was their child. That brother was my brother. That father was my father. Those dead are my dead. And that summons to answer for those things descends to me. Then tell wind and fire where to stop, but don't tell me." And I think this is, one, such a great speech. She's such an interesting character, but also that metaphor of wind and fire is really interesting because Madame Defarge is arguing, and I think Dickens is arguing through her, that the French Revolution and the violence of it is one sort of like a force of nature, sort of the natural outcome of the years of oppression and violence, but also that it is unstoppable. Like fire, once it has been started, you can't just stop it. Once the violence has broken out, it will spread. I think Charles Dickens believed and is arguing in this novel that the French Revolution was the inevitable outcome of years of consistent oppression and cruelty put upon the people of France by the upper classes and the aristocracy. And I also think that by making that point in A Tale of Two Cities, he is also trying to comment on the Victorian period, and he's also trying to say, you know, if you treat people badly, this is the kind of thing that will happen. We need to fix our system. You see a lot of social criticism in a lot of Dickens's books, and a lot of criticisms of oppression and of the treatment of the lower classes in Britain. And I feel like A Tale of Two Cities, while it's an interesting novel to read if you're interested in the French Revolution, I think it also feeds into a lot of concerns in the Victorian period and can tell you a lot about the Victorian period. Thinking about Charles Dickens's kind of argument overall about the French Revolution, I think he's kind of arguing that the French Revolution and the violence of it had a lot of just causes, but that doesn't mean the violence is justified. I'm going to quote again from Sidney Carton's thoughts at the end of the novel, because I think this is an interesting line. "I see a beautiful city and a brilliant people rising from this abyss, and in their struggles to be truly free, in their triumphs and defeats, through long years to come, I see the evil of this time and of the previous time of which this is the natural birth, gradually making expiation for itself and wearing out." And I think this is an interesting line because we see this idea of the French Revolution being the natural birth of the oppression previously, but also of it being as evil a time and as evil a regime as what came before, but also this idea of like France and Paris and the French people kind of rising from the ashes to go on to build something better is obviously really key. Another thing I wanted to mention in like the French Revolution, obviously, as I've mentioned before, gender in Charles Dickens is a really interesting element for me. And I do think it's really interesting the kind of role that women play in the French Revolution, especially Madame Defarge and the Vengeance, and kind of their importance as revolutionary figures. And these two women are kind of presented as having like even less mercy than the men, in a way, because the women have been sort of even more oppressed. And I do find that really interesting, and I do really enjoy that element. I do wonder if there's maybe a bit of a xenophobic, like, look at these terrifying French women strain running through it. I don't know. I find it interesting that Miss Pross is kind of fierce in her own way, but her fierceness is very, very different to Madame Defarge's fierceness. But anyway, I do find it interesting, Madame Defarge's role in the French Revolution, and also this idea of the importance of knitting in the French Revolution, the fact that Madame Defarge has been kind of like knitting a revolutionary register of who's gonna die. The fact that knitting, which is traditionally this very feminine, domestic task, is being used to record the names of aristocrats that they're gonna kill. Like, I think that is kind of terrifying and awesome. And apparently is a real historical thing. Someone in the Discord server put an article in the chat, so I'll leave that down below as well. I find that really interesting. Even the fact that, like, the guillotine is always referred to as a she, like, I feel like there's lots of interesting gender stuff going on in A Tale of Two Cities, even if it's not going on in the character of Lucy Manette. Another theme I want to talk about briefly before I move on to sort of plot spoiler stuff is the theme of kind of like sacrifice for a cause, because I feel like this is really interesting both in the character of Madame Defarge and Sydney Carton. We see Sydney Carton at the very end of the novel kind of making this great sacrifice in order that Charles Darnay can live and be happy and Lucy can have the family she wants. But then we also have Madame Defarge, who kind of has this sense of sacrifice in her too. I'm going to read some interesting paragraphs about her because, as I said, I do think she's a fascinating character. Imbued from her childhood with a brooding sense of wrong and an inveterate hate of a class, opportunity had developed her into a tigress. She was absolutely without pity. If she had ever had the virtue in her, it had quite gone out of her. It was nothing to her that an innocent man was to die for the sins of his forefathers. She saw not him, but them. It was nothing to her that his wife was to be made a widow and his daughter an orphan. That was insufficient punishment, because they were her natural enemies and her prey, and such had no right to live. To appeal to her was made hopeless by her having no sense of pity, even for herself. If she had been laid low on the streets in any of the many encounters in which she had been engaged, she would not have pitied herself. Nor if she had been ordered to the axe tomorrow, would she have gone to it with any softer feeling than a fierce desire to change places with the man who sent her there. Madame Defarge would gladly and easily lay down her life for the cause that she believes in, and individuals do not matter to her in the great cause, which is very interesting in terms of her feelings of sacrifice in comparison to Carton's, where Sydney Carton is literally giving up his life for a few individuals. Like, the cause of his sacrifice is Lucy, like his cause is just one woman, and the very great differences in what they're willing to sacrifice things for, I think, are really interesting. Finally, I have a few things to say about the plot and the ending, basically mostly just about how much I love the ending. I think Dr. Manette's story of his imprisonment, the paper that's found in the Bastille that explains why Dr. Manette was imprisoned, I feel like that paper is absolutely fantastically written. It is really, really harrowing, and like, that story is incredibly shocking for the present day. Like, imagine how shocking that must have been for the Victorians. This story of kidnap and rape of a pregnant woman, the murder of her husband, her brother, and herself. Like, it's so harrowing and shockingly written. And it's meant to be, obviously. But I think Dickens writes it so well. And also it comes at such an important point in the narrative, because in the first half of the book, we saw so much of the horrors and atrocities kind of committed by the upper classes on the lower classes. But then for the last, like, many chapters, we have been reading of the shocking atrocities committed by the mob on the aristocrats and anyone, and so that we get at this really key point, suddenly a reminder of why this is happening and the oppression and cruelty committed by the upper classes, and this very, like, individual, personal, harrowing account of the kind of cruelty perpetrated. Like, I feel like to be reminded of the way the upper classes treated the lower classes in such a brutal way is really, really important at that moment in time, and I feel like it is sort of like narrative genius and really, really well written. I also feel like the very end of the book and Sydney Carton's actions at the end are fantastic. I feel like Sydney Carton's plot arc as a whole is done well, although maybe I do wish we saw more of him, but I feel like his ending and his sacrifice is so well written and so fantastically done. I remembered, of course, that he sacrificed himself and that he died in Darnay's place, but I had forgotten that he drugged Darnay to do it because he knew Darnay wouldn't let him, and I feel like that scene is done really, really well. Another thing I quite like is that Sydney Carton saves Darnay for Lucy, but like both for Lucy, the woman he loves, but also for Lucy, the daughter of the woman he loves, this child who he is fond of and who is quite fond of him. Like, that he saves Darnay for both Darnay's wife and Darnay's daughter, like, I feel like is quite important. I think the way Sydney Carton makes his plan, and also the fact that we do see his hesitancy, because he kind of hopes that Dr. Manette might be able to find another solution, and then when Dr. Manette can't, he just kind of accepts his own forthcoming death. And I feel like the very end of the novel, the last few lines, are done so well. It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known. I feel like the very end of A Tale of Two Cities is so well done and so, like, emotional and beautiful. Like, it's just fantastically written. As I said earlier, I listened to quite a lot of A Tale of Two Cities while driving, but I didn't listen to the end while driving because I knew that that would make me too emotional to drive. Like, the last 6 chapters of A Tale of Two Cities, I feel like are just fantastic. Like, some of Dickens' absolute best writing. So well done. So even though I don't love A Tale of Two Cities as a whole as much as I love a lot of other Dickens books, I do think the ending is incredible. I think that's mostly what I wanted to say about A Tale of Two Cities. I feel like despite my negative feelings, I have rambled on for ages. I do love Dickens a lot. I do think A Tale of Two Cities is a fantastic book. I just feel like it's a slightly different Dickens book, and for me it lacks a few of the things I love in other Dickens books. So I do think it's great, but it's just not my favourite. Anyway, I'd be really interested to know what other people have thought about A Tale of Two Cities down in the comments, especially, you know, I know it's very well loved and I know a lot of people love it more than I do, but please do let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and otherwise that's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.